Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murder. This is Jeff Jones, and with me today to start the show is just a partial panel. Jack will be popping in as soon as he can, and Big Jeff is off after a surgery. So I'll just start from the top and say, good morning, Kelly. How are you doing?
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back as always, and let's get it going.
Yeah, let's get it going before the power runs out. Dr. Silkman, good morning. How are you feeling?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. And welcome, Jeff, and welcome, Kelly, and welcome everybody in chat. It's great to be back. Looking forward to it.
You asked to do anything else on the 7th Sergeant?
I believe I was also. At some point, apparently the command post received word that some searchers had located an area that it looked suspicious. There was plastic poking up from the ground, and it looked like the ground had been disturbed. So I was asked to go to that area along with the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, Sergeant Tyson and Lieutenant Link, and help the crime lab if they requested it to excavate that area.
Do you know on what roadway this was?
I believe it was.
This goes to show how much attention that the state had paid to the happenings and events at Cuss Road. Absolute zero, right? And we know, and Kelly will back me up on this, a lot of activity occurred at Cuss Road, as we've seen from a lot of the crime scene photographs, as well as aerial surveillance, and the fact that there were a lot of people and crews out there. And for Colburn to basically say, I was a little bit of plastic, I was called over there to do a little bit of digging, etc., etc. And the fact that Mr. Kratz completely trivialized it, in other words, that was it. There was no further discussion of the events of Cuss Road. And what's really amazing is that now, of course, we can read CASO and we can read a lot of the official documents. Mike Bushman, he was the leader of Search Team A, and a lot of things were found during that search. And we got documents where a lot of materials were written down, items that were written down on a sheet of paper. And it's remarkable that Bushman, in such an incredibly important location, was never called to the stand. And you have to ask the question, why on earth are they pulling Lincoln Colburn off the salvage yard twice to come down to Cuss Road to, quote, help dig? It's completely ludicrous and insane, guys.
I mean, his testimony comes across really flimsy to me because he's like, well, were you asked to do anything else? And he's like, well, yeah, looking at my shoes and, well, I guess there was, and it's the way he's responding it just seems like, that's a weird way to respond to a direct question about, you know, collecting potential evidence from this location. Why is it such a squirmy topic for him, right? That's the question. That's the underlying
right.
question I get when
It's
why
very
isn't he just
disappointing.
answering it? Hey, had to go over it. We checked Cuss Road out. That's part of the job. Then we went over here. Well, why don't you ask me about what else I did today? But he's kind of squirming. And I think in season 1, we talked about seat shifting. When you see people like shifting their seat and trying to squirm out, that's the feeling I get from this testimony.
He absolutely hesitated in his response to Mr. Kratz. And you could tell he was trying to think, okay, what's the best way to answer this without looking really bad and guilty? And it's rather remarkable when you think about it, guys, because Colburn is suing, of course, Netflix because they, according to him, they made him look bad and they did all these editing cuts. But let me tell you right now, Colburn looked very, very nervous when Kratz asked him about Cuss Roads, the events of Cuss Road. And we've seen the photography. There's like 8 or up to 10 vehicles and a lot of detectives and law enforcement officers at this particular crime scene. There's plenty of crime scene tape. It's a hive of activity. And, you know, when you think that the major complaint was that law enforcement was stretched for resources, you're thinking to yourself, come on, guys. This is a major crime scene, right? With all the crime scene tape, all the activity. And are you trying to tell me that you did all of this for a peat moss bag and a bit of plastic? It's completely ludicrous, guys. It really,
Why
really
are you
is.
so nervous? Why are you so nervous over a peat moss bag and some plastic? Why is this such a, you know, sensitive
Correct.
little topic there? I think you've said it before, Kel, that the more and more time goes on, you think Cuss Road might be very integral to the crime or cover up.
Yeah, it's when I first got into Cuss, I think it's, and Dr. Silkman just really made a good point. Back then I hadn't quite gone back and read what we can now, and I always just thought it was like more of a diversion. Listen, it still could be, but the more you learn about it, and I think when I went back and I did my own personal 48 hours review to see what, from the moment Teresa was reported missing up until the RAV is found, and then beyond that, what was being found when that, at that point, Cast Road slips in so perfectly, doesn't it? Because you have just a RAV on the 5th, and then come the next day, there's obviously Cast Road, and then everything is found after that event.
Day after.
The day after, yeah. So it's like, is it just this huge coincidence, or is it simply the fact that it is significant? It does play a role in it. What I've never, listen, I won't beat around the bush. I don't think I believe yet, or I don't think there's been enough evidence to provide proof that Bushman carried away a torso in an ambulance, or things were removed in that perspective. I'm not saying that that's not what happened, because it could have. I just don't think, if anything, I believe they might have found her electronics and stuff there. If anything, they found more parts of the crime there and then just started to shift it on. But yeah, Cass is a very interesting area because, in fairness, it was treated like a crime scene, and it's probably the only time in the entire case where you see that happen.
It's
Yep,
treated like a
correct.
crime scene, and then they act like there's no crime there, right? Tape it
Correct.
off, do all these things, stage things. How many vehicles? Like 12 or something like that. Vehicles,
Yeah,
and
there's a
nothing to
huge
see
number.
here, folks. Nothing to see here.
Yeah, and not forgetting that they had a helicopter, I believe, that flew over the area for most of the day, because you actually can see a lot of photographs were being taken of that area there. And also, Sheriff Pagel prevented the dogs from crossing over the line. Now, I understand that with the sniffer dogs, the scent dogs, you want to prevent any potential corruption of the crime scene, right? But then again, it seems counterintuitive. If the scent dog was giving a hit in that particular area, and also the burn barrel at the deer camp, there was a lot of activity of the dogs there too. So it clearly was an area of interest. And I agree with Kelly. You can't actually prove very easily what was actually found at Cuss, but I believe it was something that pointed directly to Teresa Horbach. The people that were out there, the detectives that were out there, knew then and then that something had happened to Teresa. And so, in essence, it would have been a much harder story to sell that Stephen had murdered Teresa Horbach there at that isolated area. And I believe all they did was they restaged the crime scene. That is, they took all the primary elements that were found there and they transposed it back to the salvage yard, right? So, and if Jack 61 was here, he would back me up on this. There is a report written by actually Fallon and also by Kratz. This was in 2006, where they described in a report bones found at the clandestine burial site. Now, the only clandestine burial site that I know of is at Cuss Road. So inadvertently, they actually let it slip that cremains were found at this area. And we've actually got a document, and we covered this in reading with the crew, in which they actually listed, Search Team A listed all the things that were potentially found at Cuss Road on the back of that piece of paper. And it's remarkable that all of these items were then later found at the Avery salvage yard one day after November the 8th. Remarkable when you think about it.
Off Cuss White Cedar Road.
This is something that Mr. Ertl yesterday talked about, a potential burial site, but wasn't. Was that your understanding? It turned out not to be?
Yes, it turned out to be nothing.
Did you do anything else on the 7th?
I think by the time we were done with that, that consumed the rest of the day.
Nothing happened, but it took us all day. I'm sorry to stop the tape so quick. I just want to make that point.
Well, the ridiculous thing is this, right? A lot of the detectives were on the Avery salvage site, and they were actually going through Barb's residence. And their task that day was to collect weapons, right? Weapons. And as you know, and Kelly will back me up on this, there were a hell of a lot of weapons on the Avery salvage site, guns, knives, you name it. Well, Colburn, Lenk, and I think there were other of Tyson as well. They were called twice to come off the Avery salvage yard and go to Cuss Road. Now you start to think to yourself, why on earth would they be pulling off detectives off the Avery salvage site to come to a location that has got no bearing in what actually took place, right? In terms of the murder. It's pretty obvious, I think, guys, that whatever transpired at Cuss Road was so significant that they had to pull more resources from the salvage yard actually onto Cuss Road, right? And it makes perfect sense now that Colburn was called twice. Now, come on, are you trying to tell me that the small area of Earth was so big that they actually had to call Lincoln Colburn to help dig? Come on, that whole idea is preposterous.
They go over and they all converge on the suspected burial site. They ultimately declare there's nothing relevant about it. But nobody really questions that the dogs, both the scent and the cadaver dogs, alert over there. The scent dogs actually track down Cuss Road onto the little gravel road that leads into the deer camp trailers that are owned by the property owner of the quarry. The dogs came over and hit on his burn barrel. Then deeper into the quarry is where pelvic bones are found. The way that you win a murder trial is to raise doubt. And you raise doubt by constructing your story of what actually happened and pointing to someone else who committed the murder. So that's the most effective way to raise doubt.
Jeff. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious when you had a look at that overhead diagram. There were critical elements which potentially could be linked to a major crime being found off the property, right? Off the salvage yard. Now, remember, the whole state's case is the fact that neither Teresa nor her RAV4 left the property, right? The murder took place at Stephen's trailer, at Stephen's garage, and then they dumped the RAV4 at the pit. Therefore, you should not be expecting to find anything of interest outside the boundaries of the salvage yard, right? Because it makes no sense. If Stephen is partially dumping cremains or remains or personal effects of Teresa, there will be no way he will be leaving those items on his own property, literally in his own back door, in his burn barrel, in the burn pit, etc., etc. He'll be dumping everything right away from his property. And you can clearly see here, you've got dog hits near the deer camp, near Cuss Roads. You've got the finding of cremains in the Manitowoc County gravel pit, which Dr. Eisenberg refused to classify as human. So you're finding all these elements outside of the salvage yard. So I think it's pretty obvious, Jeff and Kelly, that there's no way the state wants to admit that there were significant findings at Cuss Road. It'll destroy their narrative.
All states have a standard that allows a criminal defendant to point to a third-party perpetrator. Wisconsin, they call it Denny. Other states, they have a different case for it. The concept is that a defendant has a constitutional right to a fair trial, and part of a fair trial is being able to point the finger at someone else when you've been accused of murder. So it's really just that simple. Denny's got three parts to it: motive, opportunity, and direct link to the crime. Doesn't require that you prove someone committed the murder. You're trying to prove that they could have committed the murder, that they had the opportunity, they had the motive, and there's a direct link to the crime.
I mean, this is very relevant today. This is where we sit today with a lot of the issues that we're going through in the court case.
100% correct. 100% correct. And that is why, rightly or wrongly, Kathleen Zorner has pointed the finger directly at Bobby Dassey for those three Denny prongs. Now, I know we've argued this many, many times. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% perfect. And as you know from the state's response, they were very, very savage. However, now you can see why, in a way, that Kathleen Zorner had to point to Bobby Dassey, because in essence, he was able to satisfy, according to Kathleen Zorner, all three Denny prongs, right? She doesn't have to prove that he actually committed the murder, but does Bobby Dassey satisfy all three Denny prongs? Now, many people have argued this regarding Bobby Dassey, but I'll tell you what's easier to point a finger at for a Denny, Bobby Dassey or law enforcement? That's what you've got to keep in mind. I think at the back of most of our minds, of everyone on the panel, is that it's very likely that part of the setting up of Stephen took place by law enforcement. But it's going to be so much harder to try and prove that in a court of law. Just an opinion.
Well, thank you for that opinion, Dr. Silkman. I think a lot of us agree with that. And I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Jack to the show. Hey, Jack, thanks for joining us.
Yep. Hello to everyone on the panel, everyone in the live chat. It's great to be here, and I'll try to catch up and contribute what I can.
So it's part of the constitutional right you have to a fair trial. And that involves the ability to raise doubt about your own guilt. And you do that by pointing the finger at someone else. And there's an abundance of evidence that points to the adjoining property. So where do you start? You start with the people that controlled that property. And the person in control of the quarry, Josh Redant, on the 5th, when no one knows where Teresa's body is, no one knows the body has been cut up and burned in a burn barrel, claims to have seen a burn barrel burning in Stephen's backyard.
This is the path that Josh Redant traveled, where he observed the fire on Monday, October 31st.
You could obviously tell that this is a significant observation, right? The mere fact that law enforcement went to the exact same spot that Josh Redant had made the comment that he had seen a fire, right, coming from the Avery salvage yard. Now, that fire could have been totally non-nefarious. Josh Redon didn't know where that fire had come from, whether it was from the burn pit, whether it was from a burned barrel. He reckons it was from a burned barrel. Well, you know what's remarkable, and Jack 61 will back me up, the only burn barrel that he's going to be able to see are the Yonder burn barrels, because the Yonder burn barrels are closer to Josh Redon than what Stephen's burn barrel is. Right, Jack 61. Stephen's burn barrel is much further away and likely not being able to be seen by Josh Redon.
I've never done like a orient myself to where he would be. Maybe I could look at yours as interactive map where Redon would be versus where Stephen's barrel is. His barrel, we looked at that, a few days ago. It was at the right side of the property there, way up kind of to the front and over towards that cornfield, right? Is that right?
Yes.
I'll have to look at that, Doc.
Yeah, you can see from Josh Redon's perspective. I think that's Barb's place. Like he can see some of the main buildings from that location there, and Stephen's trailer. But the problem is that Stephen's burn barrel is in front of the Stevens property. Remember where Teresa Hallmark had parked her vehicle? The burn barrel,
right.
Stevens' burn barrel, was next to the van, whereas Barb Yunder's burn barrels were in the vicinity of the burn pit, but closer to Josh Redon's position, right? So if he's talking about a burn barrel, he's very likely referring to Yunder's burn barrels. And as we know, guys, human cup burnt cremains were found in Yonder burn barrel number 2. That doesn't look good.
I'd also like to know how much elevation he had in his, perspective where he was at in that little area, as opposed to the elevation of the Dess and Avery residence, because to me that could really mean the difference of actually what he could really see. He could easily have made a mistake because hell, they're right there together, right?
Correct. So you can see here on screen that big white building. That's the Yonder residence, and to the left is Stephen's trailer and garage.
Gotcha. Right? Okay. Yeah.
So from where, and mind you, Josh Redon only had a very quick glimpse of that fire, and as we'll get to see, the law enforcement were putting pressure on him to talk about how big that fire actually was.
Yeah, they would never pressure anyone.
Of course not.
That's why I went back to this clip, because I think it was such a great overhead shot that really puts into perspective the locations of these things. Because what we're looking at now is generally, not exactly, but in the area of what they were talking about when we go back to the tape. So I just really wanted to take another look at this vantage point. I just think it's such a valuable shot from the documentary.
Where he observed the fire on Monday, October 31st.
He's the first person who links Stephen to the crime. So we're just building it, like a brick at a time, and to the point that we think a court would find it credible. We've had to do this in other cases. You have to be very careful, and you have to eliminate people if it turns out it's not them.
Dean and Jerry could have did all of this.
Yeah, they would have investigated it. They could have seen who really done it. They were supposed to be the 2 top lawyers in Wisconsin. I think they screwed up my whole case. they didn't put no experts with the splatter in the vehicle, the burner barrels, the dog tracks. They didn't say nothing about that.
And it was all there. If they would have did everything what they were supposed to, what she's doing,
I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have had to suffer for another 11 years.
It sort of saddens me in a way that Stephen really took it out on his two attorneys, Strang and Buting, because in my opinion, they did the very best job that they could, considering, and Jack will back me up on this, because they weren't there from the beginning. And it really represented picking up the case while on the run, so to speak. And it was a huge task to take on in such a short amount of time without a lot of preparation. Now we can look back with hindsight, which is always 2020, and we can see the deficiencies in the case, and we have a different perspective now. But I think it was rather harsh for Stephen to be so critical with Strang and Buting. I really believe that they introduced many new elements that caused, in my opinion, a lot of cases to raise your eyebrows. They didn't obviously hit with fatal blows to the state, but I don't think it was 100% correct for Stephen to be so critical.
Yeah, I think that, we're never privy to, when one lawyer is dropped and, like Lloyd being the public defender and his partner, I think it was Johnson is his name, they were dropped and then Strang and Buting took over roughly 100 days in. And I say that it's around then, 90 to 100 days. But you have to wonder what this interaction between these, what happens at the handoff, because as far as I know, they're supposed to hand over everything in discovery, so forth, to the new lawyers. Now, clearly, there were many items, and immediately comes to mind is radio traffic and dispatch calls. That immediately comes to mind because these recordings were made, they had them, and they held them until, years later, we got snippets, got the 30 calls eventually there in August of 2006 when Remicker revealed that he had been reviewing some dispatch calls and so forth. But there's that's just one aspect of the case. I'm not saying it's everything. It's a really important thing because you can pick up details that a lot of times don't ever make it to a report at all, And that's specifically speaking to Manitowoc or MTSO. There's so much they didn't report at all. They just were all along for the ride and kind of did what they wanted. I'm being facetious, but I'm not. I mean, I look at what Jacobs allegedly did with the Teresa Hallbach, Teresa's message on the zipper voicemail or answering machine. What the hell, that's just another aspect. But, this interaction with Buting and Strang, yeah, they did screw up, but they were handed a bomb, literally. They were handed a bomb because there's no doubt in my mind, state was going after Stephen, and they didn't give a shit how they got him. That's just an opinion from me. No one has to agree with me, but that was their driver, and it wasn't about the truth about what happened to Teresa. So that alters their path of what they needed to do, right? So
100%
I really tend to agree with what Doc's saying. I think Stephen was a little more critical of Dean and Jerry than he should have been, even though they did screw up. I think they did what he wanted, and they followed this planting theory instead of focusing on some other areas that they really could have made a huge impact. And that is going after a lot of the documentation that we have today. It would have told a different story. And if the trail wasn't cold then, it was still warm, and they could have possibly had better, a real success in proving some real malfeasance.
Yep, I agree. And we mustn't forget that the state were hampered in a way because they weren't permitted to bring up any other third-party suspects, apart from Brendan Dassey. So that narrowed their focus a lot. There was a lot of areas that Strang and Buting were not able to go into. And Jack 61 will back me up. Every time Strang and Buting tried to mention a third-party Denny, you know that Fallon and Kratz always objected to the judge.
Yes. And we can't forget that it was around 30 days after the Brendan May 13th session that Kratz filed for the third-party stuff. So that was June of 2006. So they were basically hamstrung from then on.
The way that I look at it, and they say hindsight is 20/20, and it does seem like Stevens playing a little bit of a Monday morning quarterback here, where he's questioning things after the fact, and I think that that's probably from where he is in the case at this point. I think that's the posture he probably needs to take. But I think when you level this criticism at those two, you have to remember they were working off a pile of $400,000 minus. I think the other lawyer took like 100. What you guys know these numbers, right? Don't you, Jack? Like they didn't even have the full 400,000. They had more like 280,000 or something like that. And
Glenn and Kelly were paid 160. That left 240, which was 120 each for Dean and Jerry.
Right. And experts cost money.
I guess I did an article with a magazine that talks about my two lawyers, Dean and Jerry.
Avery is turning on that legal team, blaming them for his incarceration. His new letter listing 15 complaints, including a lack of experts, and claiming they ignored the evidence, writing that the pair wouldn't tell me what was going on in my case at all. Those lawyers denying those claims to ABC overnight, saying because he was in jail before his trial, Stephen could not know immediately all of the investigative steps we took on his behalf.
I know in my heart that we worked as hard as we possibly could on Stephen's behalf and really tried our best. But there was 25,000 pages of discovery and hundreds of hours of CDs and DVDs and recordings in this case.
Stephen Avery had really good, very strong lawyers who represented him vigorously, and they couldn't win the case. But for him to blame them now, I think, is a mistake. And they issued a statement to us, sort of sadly saying that they think he's mistaken, but they can understand, considering that he's been falsely imprisoned.
You don't have the luxury at this point, if you're picking up a case this late, of overlooking any possible reason for a new trial, any possible area of new evidence. Stephen Avery's lawyers ought to be looking at ineffective assistance of counsel by Dean Strang and by Jerry Buting, just as they ought to be looking at every other possible area of newly discovered evidence or unlikely grounds for relief.
I think it's such a mature and logical and legal argument that he's making right here to say, yeah, I don't think that we made mistakes in the case. That said, nothing is off the table to try to get freedom. And I think that that's an important part. If you have to point the finger at us because we screwed it up, then I'm willing to take that heat. And I think it's just a really mature thing that you don't always see from lawyers, right? They usually want to deflect blame and blame the other guy or blame the other side. So it's a little refreshing here.
Well, this case has had so much publicity. It's not like your normal standard case that occurs behind closed doors. here, literally millions of people participated per se in what happened, all the trials and tribulations with the families, etc., etc. So it's very, very unusual. And normally this spotlight wouldn't be on the attorneys in the way that it is. But you're correct. Elise Strang was mature enough to say, well, you know, we tried our best. We tried to cover as many bases as possible. But sometimes, you know, the unexpected happens, right? And, you know, Kathleen Zellner delved with her specialists, were able to delve into areas that Strang and Buting couldn't, right? Because they never had all the experts that Kathleen Zellner has. And Stephen would have ran out of money really super quick if he had, you know, 5 or 6 experts to help him. And this goes to show what we've already discussed many, many times. You got to get it right the first time, right, guys? You got to have. You would have had to have Kathleen Zellner represent Stephen the first time round with her experts and her money behind her. And I believe that had she been there with all the things that she's uncovered, especially with things like Ida Mafel, I think it would have really thrown in an element of doubt.
In another portion of that interview and In Touch, he's asked about the victim's family, and he says, quote, once the truth comes out, I think they'll regret what they all said about me. He goes on to say he's 1,000% confident that he'll be released. So how likely, I don't think I need to even ask this. It's probably not happening.
It's not like, well, look, his new lawyer is a terrific lawyer named Kathleen Zellner, and she's been hinting that she's got some new evidence that's going to release him, and it sounds like that's empowering and exciting Stephen Avery. But from my perspective, I think it's very unlikely Stephen Avery will be released in connection with this case.
Good morning, I'm Joy Cardine. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio on this Friday, August 12th.
It's currently 70 degrees, still very humid out there. Some spotty showers out there this morning. We, of course, will keep you posted.
Traffic delays are a definite possibility as the Green Bay Packers play tonight in the first preseason game of the year.
Breaking news coming out of federal court.
We have breaking news, and we're going to go into programming for a moment.
A major development in the Teresa Halbach murder case.
A federal judge has overturned the murder conviction of Brendan Dassey.
A major reversal of fortune tonight, suddenly overturned.
The federal judge has tossed out his murder conviction.
After 9 years of incarceration, he may finally go free.
It's not every day you hear this, a murder conviction overturned.
You know, either one of you can take it, and I'm sure you have a lot to say on this. This is going to be, for me, maybe the hardest part of this entire Making a Murderer 2 series is to go through this progression of the hope that is given to Brendan Dassey. And I hearken back to the Shawshank Redemption, where they say hope is a dangerous thing.
Yes, it is. But, you know, and we'll discuss it as we continue the series. But, you know, both of the attorneys acting on behalf of Brendan Dassey, they work really, really hard, right? And in order to gain habeas corpus, and Jack 61 will back me up on this, is extremely hard and extremely rare, right? A judge has to consider all factors. And for Judge Duffin, I think it took him over 10 months before he came up to his decision. He considered everything. And for a judge of his stature and experience and knowledge to say, hey, look, this confession that you solicited out of Brendan Dassey is just garbage. You guys coerced the confession out of him, right? You did A, B, C, D. Now, this is pretty significant and major for a judge to say, guys, I'm throwing this out. Right? Yes, you have various options. You can release him, you can retrial him, you can appeal, but you can't use that confession again. It's not going to stick. So therefore, Can you imagine the excitement for the attorneys representing Brendan? You can see them here. They are delighted. But we know who was working in the background. We know who was putting up his hand saying, I'm not going to let this go through. So you have the agony and the ecstasy. It's a terrible, terrible thing to play with someone's life like that. It's shocking.
Yeah, it is. It is shocking. And hey, Jack, I know that you've talked a lot about Judge Duffin's decision in the past, and I think that you've always said that you appreciated it, that it looked like a clear-headed perspective to you. Did you care to comment on that?
Well, yeah, because I did read a lot about it. I know Doc did, and others. I read Duffin's brief. Probably, I read it twice. Just reading it myself. And I know that we have read it at least once. We memorialized it on a live at some point, and actually we did it not that long ago. And, for Judge Duffin, he did take, I think, as Doc alluded to, almost a year. I think it was 10 months and change. And he looked at the totality of how these investigators worked Brendan. And, there were things that he didn't bring in that I really kind of wished he would have. But, another aspect, maybe he was thinking it in the back of his mind and just didn't include it in his brief, is this time lapse between, October 31st and then, Brendan's talked to by O'Neill and Baldwin up there in Kribitz. Skorlinski, he yelled at him for, an hour or whatever the hell it was on the 10th. But really, there was no real contact with Brendan in regards to the case until we jump forward to February of 2006. And, the reasons that, whatever they were working on, its work product, we'll never see it, never. But as time has went on, clearly, to me, it's so clear that they were working to try to find a way to connect Teresa to Stephen in some capacity, and they just couldn't do it. They didn't have anything inside his house or garage, and Kratz knew he had to have that. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind, because I'm sure we don't like him, but he's thinking ahead to trial and what's he going to present to a jury? Well, she wasn't in his house. We can't prove she was in his house, and that's a big deal. If you're going to say, hey, he did all this shit to her. If she wasn't in the house or the garage, that would kind of really mean he would have had to have killed her there in the driveway at a RAV or somewhere in the yard. So he
saw her walking towards, and then she doesn't go in the house and she doesn't get murdered in there. Well, where did she, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the narrative that Ken Kratz set out. So I'm agreeing with your point there, Chuck.
Absolutely. So, but when it comes down to it, I think Duffin was really brave in what he did, knowing, I'm sure he knew it was a bomb. I know he felt that, but at the same time, I think his reasoning was his writing was reasonable, but he didn't go to any extremes to justify the end result. I think it was just a brilliant document that ultimately, with Alan Bonk, I have real problems with it, this aspect, and I don't care if it went one way or the other. Once the decision was made, it's like, well, the state didn't like it, so they get another chance. And I'm sorry, to me, that this is a route that gives the state an advantage. It always would give the state an advantage, because juries and judges, they want to assign blame. I don't give a shit what case it is. They want someone to blame for this person being dead or injured or whatever. So for them, I'm sure in their mind, these other, when they got to the en banc, it was like, holy shit. It was like, well, the wild, wild west to me. I don't know. I didn't like the en banc. I don't like the process of the en banc. These other judges had already ruled. It's a done deal. He gets out. So to allow it to happen, I got to tell you, I didn't like it, but yeah, Duffin's 91-page brief, simply fantastic in my view.
100% agree there, Jack 61. And anyone with a functioning brain can go over the coercion or go over the interrogation of Brendan Dassey by Fassbender and Uyghur and realize the amount of potholes in Brendan Dassey's recollections. Brendan Dassey was not able to tell Fassbender and Uyghur anything unique about the murder of Teresa Halbach. Basically, he was guessing. A lot of times he got things completely wrong, but damning, and Jack 61 will agree, was that he was being guided by Fassbender and Uyghur. The narrative was being guided. The story was being guided by the two investigators who were interrogating him. It's pretty obvious that Judge Duffin is no dummy. He looked at it from, from a cold perspective. All right, let's have a look to see if anything nefarious took place here. And Judge Duffin came to the conclusion that both Fassbender and Uyghur were really guiding the narrative. And they were telling Brendan Dassey, hey, look, we already know what happened. We already know what happened. So they were guiding Brendan into telling their narrative, their version of events. And every time Brendan Dassey got something wrong, they told him, no, that cannot be right. We know what happened. We just want you to tell us. So Judge Duffin was very, very brave. In fact, he didn't have to be brave. Anyone could see that Brendan was coerced. It was garbage, right? But we knew that confession was used by Mr. Kratz in that press conference, right, Jack 61, because the state had no idea of the narrative. They had no idea what happened to Teresa Halbach. Their own crime scene detectives told them, hey, nothing occurred in the trailer, nothing occurred in the garage, right? So they needed Brendan to tell them, basically tell a story of what happened to Teresa that fateful day.
Yeah, that, and it's again, we talk about the justice system as a whole, and it's only as good as the people that are in charge. So in this instance here, just talking about what Doc's talking about, and some of the things that were said about Brendan, I'll talk specifically about he was crying at this party and he had lost weight and blah blah blah, and Fallon being Fallon. He says, "Oh well, that's because he just couldn't stand everything that had happened on that they'd done to Teresa." Well, that was a lie. Brendan told him, and he had told Kayla apparently, and anyone else that was close to him. It was because his girlfriend broke up with him, and some of the kids at school were calling him heavy, calling him fat, and he was really. I mean, I guess they really liked this girl. He was upset about it. He was crying, but they twisted that. They took that information. And use that against him in the worst way. This is it's terrible. They did it, and they did some other things too that were really kind of eye-opening to me. Which you don't really ever hear about it, but it did happen. There was a phone call where Barb was talking to Brendan. One of Brendan's calls that. Apparently, these two investigators had told Barb and the family that Brendan was a drug addict, crack addict. They tested did a blood test. Why would they do that? Why would they say that? They did it to manipulate the whole family. And so, when Barb talked to Brendan the next time, and he's like, "No, they didn't do no blood test or anything like that. That didn't happen." It's crazy. So, go ahead, Doc.
Sorry, Jack 61, but it also goes to show how desperate the state were to get a conviction.
Yes, that's right.
If they were reliant on all these underhanded methods, and they were being so sleazy and disgusting in their approach, it goes to show how desperate they really, really were, and how far they were willing to go to get a conviction. because they knew that Brendan was Stephen's alibi. So if Brendan kept on saying, "Hey, look, nothing happened here. I went over and I helped my uncle clean up. We burnt a few things, and then I went home. Nothing happened
That's
while I
right.
was there." It's going to make the state's case really, really hard. So they had to absolutely go for Brendan. Correct, Jack 61?
That's right. And Doc, remember, we've listened to it a couple of times on lives. Remember the interview that Anjanette Levy did with Brendan? And she tried. It was horrible.
She almost had an excitement in her voice, hoping that Brendan was going to break down and cry and confess. But he did
That's right.
He did nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. And for Anjanette, who should have known better, could not accept it. She clearly took the side of law enforcement. She was not displaying an unbiased approach, and almost had disbelief in her voice, thinking, wait a minute, are you trying to say that nothing took place? Yep, nothing took place. I went over there, I helped my uncle, I came home. It's terrible.
It is, and I can't prove it. This is speculation, and almost really kind of an opinion. After listening to that call several times, I'm almost of the opinion that this was something that was suggested to her by maybe someone possibly in law enforcement. Why don't you call him, see if you can get him to talk? Big interview. You're a pretty young reporter. See if you can get him to talk. He knows who you are. I don't know. I could be wrong in that. I please don't anyone take that as gospel. This is just me, sitting here spitballing and a little bit more than spitballing. Because if you listen to what she says to him, she's convinced that he did it, and he's telling her no. And and then what's even worse though, she refused to air it. Refused to air that interview.
100% correct, because it was an alternative view from what the state presented or what the state went with, and Anjanette knew that if she had put that to air, she may have been tossed out to any other meetings involving the attorneys. Right, Jack 61?
Absolutely. That's right, exactly right.
So she no longer would have been part of the so-called inner circle, because you see Anjanette Levy right throughout the series. So she decided not to have aired that, which I believe would have been a real mistake. And had she had the gumption to show it, it would have been kudos to her, because you can see what Judge Duffin did. Judge Duffin, he examined the interrogation, said, no, this is just pure garbage. And that would have been kudos to Anjanette, but Anjanette really, she didn't want to toe that line, so she decided not to air it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that's one of those situations with Anjanette Levy that makes me uncomfortable again. Well, we're at that point of the show, guys, where we're going to have to wrap it up. Kel, unfortunately, literally Australia, at least her portion of it, turned their power off in the middle of our recording. So I just wanted to say thanks again for Kel for sticking it out to literally the last second she had electricity to give for the podcast. And today we kind of hit a few things. We talked about having experts. We talked a little bit about the evidence in Redance. We talked about Stephen kind of angling at Dean and Jerry as bad lawyers, and there was a little dust up there in the media about it. And then we're kind of moving into this, Brendan briefly thinking that he's going to get some freedom, but looks like we'll have to do that mostly in the next episode. So Big Jeff isn't here, so we'll have to go with another guy named Jay. Jack, why don't you lead off the wrap-up comments?
Well, I'm sure my wrap-up will not be as concise as Jeff. He's always really good, and unfortunately, I was late getting in tonight. But looking at this is a good episode. It does examine many different things, a lot of different aspects of the case. We talked at length here about Brendan, which to me is a really important, it's a hugely important piece of the case. Talking about the experts, and I agree that it would have been great if Dean and Jerry could have afforded the amount of experts that the state did. I mean, they had basically an unlimited bank account. They could pay these experts. Eisenberg made several $1,000s between November 05 and I think January or February of 06. Eisenberg, so many others. He was a big pile of money, and there were a lot of people getting their hands in it. Dean and Jerry didn't have that option. I suppose that they could have potentially asked some experts if they would, do pro bono, give their opinion for a very low or reduced or zero cost. But I don't know how these relationships work, so maybe that was just not an option at all. I guess I'm totally with this feeling, though, of our ending piece with Brendan and Judge Duffin, and then eventually we're going to talk about, I'm sure in the next episode, the actions of the Attorney General Brett Schimmel and the state itself. So that's my comments. Sorry I missed a part of it, but on to the next.
I think Dr. Silkman has also experienced some of his own technical issues, so you'll have the last word on that today, Jack. So for Dr. Silkman and Jack and Kel and Big Jeff with his feet up at home, this has been I'm Jeff Jones, and this has been Discussing a Murderer.